Old man's 3-day wait at airport security guards discovery calls for immediate backup. About to start what appeared to be just another 29-year-old security guard Morris Watson of Silverwind Airport. Daily shift small did he realize his meeting with an enigmatic old. The guy would change everything perfectly dressed and clutching a bouquet of dying roses the old man had been waiting at the airport for days. His constant presence had grown the subject of inquiry and conjecture among the airport personnel and travelers when Morrice eventually came across the startling reality he discovered made his cold blood runs quickly. He was phoning for backup, knowing that every second tallied. Before we delve into comments below, where you are observing or listening from now, and remember to subscribe. Early morning sun hardly if you enjoy this amazing narrative. Peeked via the large windows of Silverwind Airport as Morrice Watson, 29, started his regular morning duty as an airport security guard. The first wave of movement in the building was just beginning. Travelers rolling in their soft rumble against the shiny surface. Floor Morrice corrected a wrinkle in his neat dark blue suit by straightening it out as he looked at the once exciting bustle of the progressively filling terminal he had been working in for 5 years. Of the airport had turned into a steady buzz of activity. The faces changed daily, but the rhythm stayed the same, a ceaseless, continuous ebb and flow of arrivals and departures, hells and goodbyes. As he moved through the arrivals hall, Morrice observed the typical mix of individuals. There were business people in sharp suits, their eyes fixed on families with eager children straining their necks to view cell phones. Familiar features and tired travelers moving with sloping shoulders and blurry eyes created a tapestry of human events all entwined in this fleeting environment. Morrice first noticed his eyes straying over the rows of benches, a trained pattern of observation. Sitting on one of the benches, an elderly man, most certainly in his 80s. Something about him caused Morrice to stop momentarily. The man was immaculately dressed in a soft beige jacket emphasizing respect and care, his posture somewhat slanted yet with age kept some pride, but it was the bouquet of vivid. Beside the man, red roses sitting on his lap attracted Morrice's eye. Close to them, a little travel cushion suggested some sort of usefulness within the formality of his look as Morrice observed the eyes of an old man peered over the assembly, a mix of hope and fear clear in his eyes gleamed with expectancy, as though he were waiting for someone particular. Morrice couldn't get rid of the impression he had seen this man before, maybe yesterday, but he couldn't be positive. In the continuous flow of passengers across the airport, faces usually merged together. Morrice was about to finish his rounds when the old guy indicated for his attention. There was a softness in the movement that let Morrice approach without thinking twice. "Excuse me, young man," the elderly man stated. His voice was faint but clear. "I don't mean to disturb you, but could you kindly let me know when Flight 335 will?" Morrice was surprised by the man's kind demeanor. It was a welcome change. Shift from the usually irritated travelers he dealt with daily. "I'm sorry, Sir," Morrice answered with a smile as security. "I lack access to the flight schedules. Nevertheless, if you look over there," he indicated a big digital board on the far wall. All the arrival times shown on the elderly man's face lit up. "Thank you so much. I regret to have bothered you so greatly. I just desire someone incredibly unique. Thus I wouldn't want to miss her entrance for the world." The man's words filled with expectation and a trace of anxiety touched something in Morrice and discovered he was actually smiling at the man's clear enthusiasm and good luck. Morrice left, walking away. Politeness, no issue at all. "I hope you meet your special someone soon." His rounds revealed the smile still on his face, the interaction brief, but there was something about the manner of the old man was a reflection of a time that appreciated politeness and tolerance that left a nice. Morrice put the event away as a normal part of his schedule without expecting that this small exchange would shortly turn into the catalyst for a significant transformation in his life, as it normally did for Morrice. The day went on. He addressed the typical range of minor disputes and issues related to his profession, lost luggage, confused travelers, and the sporadic security issue. By the time his shift was finishing, Morrice was looking forward going home and relaxing as he left the security room with thoughts already on the peaceful evening. Morrice was walking by the arrivals hall once again. The area had transformed since dawn, now bursting with the warm. The audience had dwindled greatly, with only a few golden light of the setting sun flowing through the windows. Stragglers left when Moore visited the elderly guy once more in the morning. He remained seated exactly in the same place, the bouquet of roses still gently held in his lap. The image made Morrice stop in his tracks. The elderly man's eyes were still surveying the decreasing throng, yet his posture showed tiredness not seen in the morning. Hope in his eyes seemed faint, mixed with a mounting fear Morrice could feel even from a distance. Before Morrice could restrain himself. "Sir, did you manage to find the old man you were waiting for?" Turned at the sound of Moore's voice, there was a moment of doubt, a flutter of something, despair and shame on his face before he spoke gently. "I'm still waiting. She should be here shortly." Stopped then, with a forced smile. "Have a nice..." Morrice, now at the exit, waved a farewell hand. "You too, sir. Take care." Morrice could not shake the warm evening air he went outside into. Unsettling sensation the interaction had left him with made his way to his automobile, the picture of the waiting man replaying. Morrice felt it strange in his head on the way home, as his thoughts kept returning to the old man. Wasn't it for someone to be waiting that long? Maybe the flight had been postponed, he reasoned, but then would the man have understood from the arrival board Morrice had highlighted? The more Morrice considered it, the more the man's travel cushion seemed unusual, the more specifics stuck out as odd. Having him was a sign he had been ready for a protracted wait, or something else entirely. Morrice momentarily contemplated the possibility that the man might be homeless looking for cover in the airport, but that didn't fit the man's sophisticated outfit and the well-kept bunch of roses. Morrice shook his head, presumably trying to ignore the ideas. It was most likely nothing, he told himself, only an unlucky delay. Mix-up these events occurred constantly in airports even as he negotiated the. Morrice couldn't entirely eradicate the picture of the elderly man waiting alone in the evening traffic. Morrice's apartment was silent save for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the odd car that passed on the street below. Sat at his little dining table. Morrice wasn't pushing the leftover reheated lasagna around his plate. The TV droned on in the backdrop. His mind kept returning to the airport, to the old man carrying his bouquet, of truly observing it. Roses took out his phone and started browsing social media without really noticing it. Nightly helped him relax. Tonight it felt hollow. The posts and pictures of his friends and acquaintances appeared small in comparison to the enigma Morrice had set in his head. His phone down, he tried to make sense of the circumstances once more. Airports, by leaning back in his chair and massaging his eyes, were areas of waiting, constantly following all delays. The old man's loved one might have been enmeshed in traffic, or there might have been a misunderstanding on arrival times, but Morrice, the man, had been there in the morning, and he felt something about that story did not fit. He was still. Morrice left in the evening, and the delay was quite considerable. It wasn't. Morrice got up and began to pace his little living room, mentally revisiting the events in quest of clues. He might have overlooked the man's kind manner, the deliberate way he held the roses captured in his eyes a picture of hope and fear mixed together to create someone excitedly looking forward a reunion. But then why hadn't anyone come? Morrice's eyes strayed to a framed picture on his bookcase, and they landed on him with his late grandma. Saw a few months before she died. The sight of it halted him in his tracks. Monitors his grandmother's alone in her latter years, her children occupied with their own life, her friends progressively. Morrice thought of the loneliness he had seen in her eyes occasionally, even when she grinned and insisted she was okay. The remembrance sent a pang through his heart, reflected what he had seen in the elderly man's eyes, reflected deeper, more fundamental, more than just expectation. Morrice shook his head, attempting to ignore the idea he was projecting. He saw relationships where there might not be any, and yet he couldn't get rid of the impression that the narrative had more than just a delayed beginning. Morrice's thoughts kept returning to the airport as he prepared for bed. He washed his teeth, automatically his mind playing every element of his interactions with the elderly guy, the courteous approach he had asked for. Regarding the journey, the weak hold on the bouquet of roses, the tired but hopeful look in his eyes at the end of the day. Morrice slipped into bed expecting that slumber would offer a break from his whirl of ideas, but as he lay in the darkness staring at the ceiling, slumber avoided him. The picture of the elderly man seated by himself on that bench kept hovering before his view. What would happen if the elderly man stayed there waiting through the years? Never came. Morrice rolled over angrily, striking his pillow in irritation, his gut clenching with anxiety. This was absurd. Deep down, Morrice knew why he was so troubled by this, but he didn't even know the man. Was the vulnerability he had felt in the face of what would be terrible disappointment? Quiet dignity in him of his grandmother in her latter years of loneliness, which may swallow the elderly as the world changed. Too quick about them as Morrice sank into a fitful sleep, his dreams were a perplexed mix of airport terminals and solitary benches, of fading roses and mist. Links throughout all, the old guy waited, a silent sentinel in a sea of fleeting faces, when Morrice got up the next morning and set off his alert. Getting ready for his shift, he felt restless, still clinging to the discomfort of the evening like a veil. Silently promised himself today to find the truth. He owed it to the others and to himself. Compassionate elderly man who had awakened something deep inside him to discover what truly was going. Early morning air was clear as Morrice headed into Silverwind Airport, arriving earlier than usual. Driven by a mix of interest and worry that had followed him from a sleepless night, the airport was still at this hour. There were just a few early travelers and the night shift crew getting ready to clock. Just as Morrice strolled across the arrivals hall, a déjà vu swept across. His gait slowed as he neared the location where he had seen the elderly guy yesterday. From a distance, he could see a figure on the same bench, and his heart started to race. Morrice's misgivings were proved it was really the same old man, but his appearance now made Morrice's chest contracted with concern. The man was asleep, his head lying on the Morrice had seen yesterday, the bouquet of roses now conspicuously withering on his lap. He had a little travel cushion, shielded even in sleep by loosely curled fingers. Morrice stood there momentarily. Arriving on the scene, the man's fine beige jacket had just started to crease. His immaculate shoes scratched from a day of sleep. His face appeared aged, more sensitive. The lines of concern and optimism that had driven yesterday now slack with tiredness. A surge of emotions swept over Morrice, worry and a developing sense of dread. This man had obviously stayed the night in the airport. It was not unusual for individuals to wait protracted hours for delayed. Morrice was tempted to wake the man. Flights spending the night went beyond the norm, and something was clearly amiss here. He hesitated, gazing at the ask him what was going on, and if he needed help. Calm face of the elderly guy asleep following what had probably been a protracted and frustrating day of waiting. Then Morrice struggled to bring himself to disturb what little rest he could get on an airport bench. Man was getting. Instead, Morrice went to a security room, his head whirling with queries and worries. He couldn't get rid of the picture of the uniform he changed into. Sleeping guy from his head, the wilting roses, the rumpled garments, the tired. Morrice's shoulders slumped even in sleep, and everything presented a picture of continuous disappointment that pulled at him. Morrice silently promised himself he was heart-counting for his shift. Would watch the elderly man all day. If the circumstances hadn't altered by afternoon, he would. Must step in regardless of how uncomfortable or intrusive it might feel. Anything was obviously wrong, and Morrice started his rounds of inquiry with an increasing sense of obligation to sort everything out. Why hadn't they kept returning to the sleeping figure on the bench? Who was this man waiting for so patiently? Come, and most crucially, what could Morrice do to assist the day that was still to be lived with? The regular chores and duties, but for Morrice they were now underscored by a quiet strain. He found himself looking at the clock more frequently than normal, counting down the hours till he could visit the elderly man. Once more, in quiet moments between his responsibilities, Morrice found himself picturing several possibilities. Maybe the man was perhaps waiting for a long-lost love to be reunited after years apart. Was an Links and distant family member had crossed regarding the meeting time Morrice considered. Seemed to generate more questions than answers as Morrice's lunchtime approached. Made up his decision. He would see the man once more, and this time he would strike up a conversation he needed to. Grasp what was happening, but more importantly, he had to make sure the elderly man was all okay. Whatever was going on, Morrice marched back towards the arrivals hall with a mixture of purpose and anxiety. Morrice was now dedicated to see this enigmatic waiting man, through little knew that this choice would start a sequence of events challenging his views, test his compassion, and finally changes his life permanently as Morrice approaches the bench. Where the old man had been dozing earlier, he discovered him now awake and aware. Although fatigued still, the guy's eyes held that combination of hope and concern Morrice had observed before the bouquet of roses, now clearly wilted. Gripped on his lap like a lifeline, Morrice stole a long breath to steel himself for the discourse. Ahead, he knew he had to be careful, honoring the man's privacy, while also handling his developing anxieties. Excite me, Sir. Morrice started, his voice soft but strong. I hope you won't mind me asking, is everything good? I couldn't help but note you have been here since yesterday. The old man looked up, a flutter of identification across his features. He seemed shocked as he watched Morrice in his security outfit for a time, as though, oh sure, yes. Suddenly aware of his length of stay, he answered, his voice a bit hoarse from neglect. Everything is good, young man. I simply need someone. Morrice nodded, sure of it. Still, he couldn't get rid of his worry, so he decided to press a small bit here soon. Hello, sir. You have been here for quite some time. Have you had anything to eat? Is there someone else here?
I mean, not to pry.
I can ask. Morrice's obvious concern for the elderly man's face softened. You are quite nice to ask, but honestly I'm good. My friend will be here any minute now. Don't want to miss her arrival. Morrice paused, then decided. To be more frank, sir, I'm sorry if this seems forward, but I have to ask if you have anywhere to go. The airport isn't really a location for extended stays. So, the elderly man's calm broke. Was a flutter of anxiety across his face before he settled back. Attitude? Oh no, young man. I have a great attitude. I am not homeless, if that is what you are thinking. Home, it's just well. But it's crucial that I be here when she gets here. Morrice nodded, relieved to hear that the man was not homeless, but nonetheless concerned by the circumstances. I know, sir. Maybe we could find a nice spot for you to wait. Perhaps we might find out the state of the flight you are awaiting. The elderly man shook his head, a soft but forceful denial. No, not that would be required. I'm perfectly at ease here, and convinced she'll be here very soon. Morrice's heart was drawn to something in the man's voice that combined hope with desperation. He recognized that continuing forward at this point may only cause the man to shut down totally. All good, Sir. Morrice agreed. However, kindly, if you require anything, food, water, or any other form of help, don't hesitate. Morrice is my name, and I will be here all day. The elderly man grinned, a real one, though clearly tired, warmth in his eyes. Thanks you, Morrice. Your parents must be a fine young man. Morrice felt proud as he left, his mind racing. The talk had done, not sure if anything could relieve his worries. It had deepened them. The man obviously wasn't going to depart freely, and even if he wasn't breaking any laws per, Morrice chose to select based on his unique and maybe dangerous extended stay. Over his shift, he would closely monitor the circumstances and make sure the man had water and maybe even bring him some food from the airport cafe, if at the end of the day there still lacked any indication of the. Morrice found himself circling someone he was waiting for, knowing he would have to act more forcefully. Returning to the bench of the elderly man more often than his duties exactly mandated each time he passed the guy was their watches and alerts the fading roses still nestled in his lap. The hope, in his view, a little more seemed to fade with every hour, replaced by an increasing uneasiness Morrice had becoming impossible to overlook. Finally, as his shift was almost over, Morrice made a choice. He couldn't go without knowing more about this man's circumstances, combining will with knowledge too. Fear. He went back to the bench. Sir. Morrice started quietly. Though I would want to ask, I am worried about you since you have been here for quite some time. Is there anything I could do? Can help. Maybe we might try to get in touch with the elderly man you are waiting for. Morrice looked up, and for a time he appeared to dismiss the concern once more, but then his countenance altered. The surface of patient waiting fell apart to expose a fragility that made Morrice's heart take. Young guy, the elderly gentleman murmured, his voice quivering slightly. I suppose, well, the young man said. Imagine it wouldn't harm to discuss it. My name is Walter, by the way, Walter. Sitting close to Walter, Davis Morrice respectedly kept his distance, although. It's good to meet you properly, Mr. Davis. Morrice Watson, can you tell close enough to hear the man's kind voice? About the person you're waiting for. Walter's eyes. I started to grin, playing. Her name is Rosa. She's healthy and, most importantly, at the corners of his mouth. Great woman I have ever known. As Walter pulled his own phone, his gnarled fingertips with startling accuracy across the screen, he drew up a profile photo of an old woman with silver hair framing a face spread with laugh lines, her eyes sparkling with warmth. We have been dating. Walter started, his voice 2 years ago, full of pride mixed with longing. Can you believe that at my age? Finding love once more is a miracle. Morrice listened to with increasing sense of hope. Though it was not unusual these days, of discomfort growing in his gut. Internet dating wasn't. Something about this felt strange. Walter scrolled through his phone, showing us Moore's text messages full of love and affection we have never personally experienced before. He clarified her residence. Africa, you see now. She has cancer, and she is finally arriving here. Coming for therapy, I would assist her to take care of her. Morrice's heart sunk as the bits began to come into place and asked Mr. Davis, trying to keep his voice neutral. This must be costly, the travel, the medical treatments. Walter nodded, his eyes gleaming with unshed tears. It is, but she is worth every dime I have brought. $33,000 in cash. With me, all I have is all I have. However, what good is money if you cannot use it to support the people you love? Love. The alarm bells that Morrice's mind had been silently ringing suddenly blared at full volume. Money. All pointed to one. Online dating, someone from another country seeking money for medical treatments. Awful ending, Mr. Davis, Morrice said gently, considering when Rosa was expected to. Walter's face collapsed. She was supposed to arrive 2 days ago, but there was. She should be here. She needed additional money to rebook her ticket for an issue with her aircraft in Africa. Morrice felt a flood of melancholy and rage right now. This type hopeful man had been taken in by a dishonest fraud. Yet, how could he let him know? How could he break the optimism that had kept Walter going for the past 3 days before Morrice could find out how? Walter's phone buzzed. The old man's face lit up as he stared at the screen. She says she wants to go. She arrived just now and will be leaving in 10 minutes. She reminds me to pack the... Walter gleamed with money from all the lines of his face. Morrice felt as though he had been assured she would come. Love always finds a way. Struck in the gut, he understood the terrible ending of this complex fraud. In that instant, he took a split-second decision, altering everything Mr. Davis said, his voice strong but gentle. You need to believe me, can. Morrice's abrupt change in tone confused you. Walter nodded reluctantly. I'm going to call for some help. I promise to explain everything, but going to take your phone for a moment. I need you right now to stay here and not leave. Could you kindly help me? Walter's uncertainty worsened, but Morrice's earnest look caused him to nod in accord with a heavy heart, but a resolute one. Spirit Mace grabbed the phone, turned away, and fast dialed for backup. As he spoke, he could observe Walter on hushed, urgent tones, so explaining the matter to his colleagues, cops. The bench gripping his roses, his eyes glued on the exit, awaiting a woman never to come, knew that Walter's world would be shattered in the following few minutes, but he also realized he couldn't watch and let this wonderful elderly man lose his life. Savings with backup on the road, Mace stole for what was to come. Morrice was resolved to tell the drama that had been developing over the past 3 days its climax and make sure that, even with the approaching heartbreak, it wouldn't finish in tragic. His heartbeat as he went back to the bench, aware backup was en route. He looked at Walter, who was remaining seated on the bench, With his phone and the faded bouquet of flowers, the elderly man's gaze locked on them. Morrice felt a pang as he left a mixture of exhilaration and fear clearly on his face. Of remorse aware of the events minutes Morrice's friend was about to experience. As other police started to show up, they were wearing simple attire that fit the traveler population perfectly. Morrice watched as they adopted deliberate yet casual strategic positions close to the exit. Drew Officer Sarah Chen's attention with a subdued nod, then turned back to indicate the team was in. Morrice turned back to Walter, who appeared uninformed of the abrupt surge in undercover security staff around. The old man was fidgety, his gaze straying between his phone and the "Leave, Mr. Davis," Morrice whispered softly. Walter gazed up, a quivering smile on his face. "Oh sure, just a little anxious. I hope I look, since this is our first time meeting personally, like my pictures." Morrice felt a lump in his throat and yearned just for tell Walter the truth to guard him from the approaching heartbreak. But right now, most of all, Morrice remarked, important thing was to keep Walter safe and catch the criminals who had manipulated him. "I'm sure it will be fine. Now, keep exactly here, okay? Remember what I said? No matter what. Force a smile. Happens from this location. Could you kindly guarantee me?" Walter nodded, even though he seemed a bit perplexed by Morrice's resistance. "Of course, young man, but why is it just?" Morrice lied easily for security's sake. "Trust me, good. Airport process." Walter agreed. Morrice's radio crackled softly. His squad was ready and in position, and the air's tension was felt while Walter waited for the scammers to act. He's still uninformed. Morrice's hand moved to his while he watched the drama playing out around him with great expectation. The exit. Hidden weapon. He expected it wouldn't come to pass, but he was ready for any. Walter's and the other citizens' safety in the airport was his first concern as the minutes passed. Morrice could sense his squad preparing. The trap was set. Now all they could do was wait. The busy airport carried on with regular rhythm around the scammers, unaware of their walking straight into it. Morrice was reading Walter's face and noticed the lines of hope boiling beneath the surface. With enthusiasm carved there, it hurt him to realize the identical lines will soon be changed form met into ones of pain and disillusionment, but stole from himself. Reminded himself that what they were doing was essential for not only Walter, but maybe many other weaker people who can be victims of these con artists. The waiting looked interminable. Morrice checked his watch, then looked around once more. His squad stayed vigilant, their eyes never stopping, traveling in search of any indication of the suspects. The airport ambient noise, the travelers chatting and suitcase rolling over the PA system all vanished into the backdrop as Morrice's senses honed totally on the choreography at hand. And then, at the door from the parking lot, there was motion. Morrice's pulse accelerated when he saw two men walking into the airport, their eyes darting across the assembly with. The newcomers moved through the throng with purposeful casualism, while sporting black coats and headgear. Their gaze ultimately turned across the assembly to find Walter. Morrice's pulse quicken. This was it. Morrice could see everyone staring at Walter, absorbing the roses, and the eager look on his face communicated a quiet confirmation between them. Morrice's breath seized in his throat. He tensed, poised to leap into. The following 5 minutes would be vital. He saw Walter staring at the confused men, plainly not anticipating them. Instead of Rosa, now Morrice barked into his radio, springing forward instantly, and the scene burst into controlled chaos. Morrice's crew gathered on the two suspects with trained deficiencies. Officer Chin tackled the shorter man exactly as his hand came out of his pocket and sent something skittering across the floor. A phone rather than a weapon, Morrice noted with relief. The taller suspect sought to flee, but he was soon surrounded by two other cops. Morrice himself stood shielding Walter, who had frozen in shock, the roses falling from his. Morrice yelled, his voice with authority that sliced across the abrupt movement of airport security. Travelers in the area gasped and turned back to form a circle of space around the developing scene, some of which pulled. While some rushed away, not wanting to film the occurrence, others used their phones. Included the two suspects, realizing they were overwhelmed and cornered, raising their hands in surrender. Morrice could See the terror in their eyes when they realized their plan had brilliantly backfired. On your knees, hands behind your head, officer, Chin demanded, her voice clear and authoritative as the suspects cooperated. Morrice's squad arrived to handcuff them. The sound of metal clicking into place seemed to echo in the momentarily silent area. Morrice watched as his colleagues searched down the suspects, pulling wallets and a tiny notebook. More thought-held specifics about their fraudulent activities. Amid the chaos, Morrice had maintained one hand on Walter's shoulder, both to guard him and stop him from interfering immediately with the imminent threat. He turned. His whole focus was on the face of the older man, Walter, a mask of uncertainty and dawning terror. His eyes flew across between the imprisoned guys and Morrice, trying to understand what was going on. Morrice spoke, shaking what's happening on where Rosa. Morrice sensed his heart. Looking at the lost look in Walter's eyes, he softly led the elderly man back to the bench so he could sit down. Mr. Davis, Walter started, his voice soft but strong. I'm sorry, but these men waved to the handcuffed detainees, trying to fool you, but Rosa here is secure now. Walter fell into the bench as his knees seemed to give up. His shoulders fell and tears filled his eyes as reality of the situation seemed to fall on him all at once. Eyes no, it cannot be whispered, just audible over the rebuilt bustle of the airport. The roses laid on the ground, their fading petals a moving reminder of Walter's. Morrice knelt down, gathering broken dreams as he held the tattered bouquet. He silently promised Walter and himself to see this through, whatever it would take. Watched the disturbance of the arrest subsided and the suspects were led away. Morrice and Walter stayed on the bench, surrounded in a bubble of startled stillness among the typical bustle of the airport. Harold's hands shook as he grabbed for one of Morrice's gathered fallen flowers. The petals were damaged and offering a nasty metaphor for his own damaged heart. Rosa spoke. Morrice felt a lump form in his barely above a whisper. It was a lie. Throat as he watched the old man struggle with the truth. I'm very sorry, Walter, he whispered softly as seated comfortably next. He should know that these con artists are pros, preying on kind-hearted individuals like you. It's not your fault. But Walter's eyes were locked on his phone, which he had taken from his pocket, shaking hands. He started reading over the letters and pictures he had sent Rosa over the past 2 years. Each word and picture that had previously made him happy now twisted in his heart like a knife. We spoke every day, Walter said. She claimed she knew everything about me, my hopes, my anxieties, my plans for the future, and her voice cracking with passion. Loved me. He glanced up at Morrice, tears and uncertainty glistening in his eyes, and asked how could all of this be false? Morrice battled to locate the correct words. How would he describe the depths of human depravity to someone whose heart was so full of love? Walter, these con artists are expert manipulators, starting meticulously. It's all a scam to gain money. They don't take the time to create trust so their victims feel unique and appreciated. Walter's face crumpled with concern for the suffering they inflict as the full weight of the dishonesty struck him. Money, he said, staring down at the sack at his feet, holding his life savings I was going to give her. I never thought I would feel this way. All I believed I had discovered love once again after my wife passed went. Once, the agony in Walter's voice was nearly intolerable. Morrice found himself at a loss for words, confronted with a sadness so raw and instantaneous. He wanted to offer comfort, but what could he might say to let Walter go to his phone, lessening this kind of treachery? Looking at Rosa's profile photo, still yearning to think maybe she is real, he said, his voice seeming begging. Perhaps she simply got confused with these nasty males. She could still be out there waiting for me. Our goals were modest, and we were going to see the globe together. Morrice softly laid his hand over Walter's, lowering the phone. Walter, although I understand this is difficult to grasp, Rosa is not the actual person shown in those pictures. The one you have been corresponding with was all part of the fraud those men devised, employed to control your emotions. I'm very sorry. The reality seeped in gradually, and Walter's remaining defenses collapsed. His body shook silently as his shoulders hunched, and he hid his face in his fists. Sobs. The bouquet of flowers lay neglected on the bench, Next them, a moving emblem of his shattered dreams, Morrice sat with Walter silently supporting him as the old guy wept around the airport, kept its relentless activity while travelers hurried past blind to the heartbreak playing out in their path. Few interested observers give compassionate looks their way, most married past buried in their own. As Walter's weeping lessened, Morrice recognized the immediate crisis had gone, but the true job of life had just begun. Healing was only starting the agony of this betrayal. The process of restoring hope and trust would persist, would be lengthy and challenging, yet while he sat there, Walter's shoulder was comfortingly held silently by a consoling hand. Promise he wouldn't let Walter handle this alone. He would assist this kind of hardy man makes his way across the shadows and hopefully toward a better future. Though the road ahead would be difficult, Morrice resolved to be there at every turn and gently grabbed Walter's shoulder. Catching the elder man's attention, Walter, Morrice said gently, his voice full of sympathy, I realize this is overwhelming right now, but you should know you're not by yourself in this. Walter looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. And here I am to assist you every stage of the process. Inquired, his voice scratchy, lost, his face etched with an anguish that appeared to age him even further. Why? From crying. Why would you wish to assist me? I am just an ignorant elderly man fallen for a scam. I should have known better. Morrice shook his head forcefully, his eyes fixed squarely on Walter's with unflinching. Walter, you are a lovely, loving person who is not at all stupid. Feels belly D in the kindness of others. If anything, the world needs more individuals like you, not something to be embarrassed of. Less, he reached into his pocket and gently pulled a business card straight into Walter's shaking hand. Morrice said, hand here, and I want you to call me anytime, day or night, if you need to speak or if you require assistance with anything pertaining to this matter, meaning anything, Walter. Whether it's inquiries regarding the legal system or simply someone to be there when things get tough. Tough. Walter fixed his gaze on the card, flipping over in his palms as though it were some priceless relic, combining thanks with anxiety flickered across his face. I'm not sure what to say, Morrice. You've already done so much. I couldn't possibly force Morrice to cut him off gently. You're not imposing, Walter. I want to assist. Also, we should discuss what Walter's expression changed to indicate what comes next. Nervous, but Morrice kept his voice steady and comforting. We will have to file a report about this fraud. You may have to talk to certain detectives. It sounds intimidating, but I will be there with you at every stage to ensure your story is heard and act as best we could to avoid these scammers from damaging others. Stopped to think about his next words carefully. Walter, I believe it would be wise for you to discuss what you have with someone qualified. Can significantly help to process by seeing a therapist or counselor specifically targeted in assisting fraud victims. Everything you're feeling, Walter nodded slowly, the weight of everything still clear in his position. I guess could be a decent concept. He confessed silently. I just feel extremely embarrassed. How could Morrice have been so easily swayed? Tough yet friendly. Walter listens to me. You have nothing to feel embarrassed about. These con artists are pros. They target people's finest traits are their compassion, their hope for capacity for love. You are a victim of crime, nothing more. Walter's eyes welled up once more, but underneath the tears there glimmered something else. Thanks, maybe even the first little spark of fortitude. Morrice experienced a wave of protectiveness, remembering what Walter had earlier revealed regarding his personal situation. Morrice felt the older man had no family left, and the idea of this lovely man confronting the consequences of the fraud alone was intolerable. Walter, I know we have only fairly met, but you should know that I am here for you as a friend as much as a security guard. Morrice was surprised when Walter stretched out and grabbed him into an embrace. Going through this together would be normal. Thank you for saving me from this and for loving. The older guy muttered, his voice full of feeling. Means more than you realize. Walter gazed at Morrice. His eyes gleamed with unshed tears. You know, he said gently, his voice wavering slightly. I began to believe the world had changed too much for young people today. Stopped, a slight smile pulling. Not interested in us elderly people anymore. Around the corners of his mouth. But Morrice, you have disproved me. Nonetheless, there is goodness out there. Morrice felt warmth rising in his breast at Walter's remarks. There are plenty of decent individuals in every generation, Mr. Davis. We simply have to watch out for one another. Morrice got up and extended his hand. Leighton gently get you home, Walter replied, and we could pause for a snack. If you would want, eat on the way. Else, we may just sit silently or discuss the following actions. Neat as they left the airport together, Morrice, supporting Walter's rather wobbly motions, realized that this was only the start of a protracted road ahead dotted with court processes, emotional challenges, and the slow healing of hope and faith. Yet Morrice was resolved to be there at every stage he had entered the scenario in as a security guard performing his duties, yet he was bidding farewell to it as a friend ready to support Walter through the difficult years ahead. Disclaimer: this channel stands against all forms of intolerance, discrimination, racism, and violations of human rights. The stories shared here are original creations, developed to encourage reflection, understanding, and constructive dialogue. All content is produced with a commitment to respecting diversity and honoring human dignity.